Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Biollywood podcast. In this series, we talk about biological threats and popular culture media that they appear in. I'm JT O'Brien, research principal at the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, and I am here with the Commission's Executive Director, Dr. Asha M. George. Today, we will be talking about the 2021 science fiction novel Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, who also wrote the critically acclaimed novel The Martian, which was adapted into an Oscar-nominated film. The novel was a finalist for the 2022 Hugo Award for Best Novel, and the audiobook, which is what Asha and I both listened to, won the 2022 Audio Award for Science Fiction, and then also the 2022 Audio Award for Audiobook of the Year. A film adaptation is in production with a projected release date of March 2026. Drew Goddard, who adapted The Martian, is slated to adapt the book into a film. And Ryan Gosling is expected to star as the protagonist, Ryland Grace. And Sandra Hüller is expected to star as the secondary main character, Eva Stratt. And for the premise of this book, it's set in the near future. It centers on a school-teacher-turned-astronaut, Ryland Grace, who wakes up from a coma afflicted with amnesia. He gradually remembers that he was sent to the Tau Ceti solar system, which is 12 light years from Earth, to find a means of reversing a solar dimming event that could cause the extinction of humanity. The story follows two storylines, each told chronologically, starting with the story on board the spacecraft called the Hail Mary, where Ryland Grace regains his memory in short bursts. And then the story is frequently intercut with flashbacks revealing earlier events leading up to the launch of the Hail Mary. If you have not read or listened to this book, we would highly recommend you experience it before continuing this podcast. This podcast will contain spoilers for Project Hail Mary, and this is your final warning. From this point forward, we will discuss spoilers. So I thought we could start either by discussing the pathogen characteristics or some of the characters, the main characters that are involved. What do you think?
Well, maybe we should talk about the pathogen characteristics because that happens pretty early in the story. You know, we don't, it's not like the story opens with, gee, it's very cold on planet Earth.
Exactly. Right.
They figure out pretty quickly that there is something that's causing it. And it sounds very much like a pathogen, right?
Right, the way it's interacting with the sun and everything like that. So let's start there.
Okay.
So astrophage is the name of the pathogen. Comes from Greek and Latin roots, which basically means star eater. Mm-hmm. It's not pathogenic in the traditional sense of causing diseases in humans or animals, but instead it poses a global threat by consuming energy from stars, which in the story leads to a catastrophic dimming effect that will wipe out humanity within about 30 years.
Yeah, and I would say technically, even though we consider disease to affect humans or animals or plants, I think this is just a question of scale. It's still a disease. It's just affecting our solar system. It's affecting
our whole ecosystem.
Suns, the whole universal ecosystem.
Biosphere and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, so it expands the notion of what the biosphere is.
Yeah, completely agree. And so the life cycle of this pathogen, it'll go through, mitosis, as we've all learned in Bio 101, which was reproduction through cell division. And then it looks for a heat source. It has to be very, very high heat. So stars are usually the primary target. And then it'll take energy from the star, and then in order to reproduce again, it needs to have carbon dioxide. So what this leads to in the novel is they call it the Petrova line, which is basically a line that you can see from the sun to Venus. And part of the book is trying to figure out why is that sun or that line going from the sun to to Venus, and they eventually figure out it's going to Venus to harvest CO2. Returning back to the star to get more heat, and it's just a complete cycle of the pathogen. And the primary danger, as we kind of discussed a little bit already, is that it consumes the energy of the sun, and it creates that dimming effect, which could eventually lead to an ice age on Earth within 30 years. It's growing exponentially. It's having exponential effects.
Mm-hmm.
And within that 30 years, you could experience the extinction of humanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So I think, too, I mean, you mentioned the characteristics with the life cycle. The very fact that we're using terms like mitosis
Yeah.
is pretty significant. The thing about seeking out a star to absorb energy, if you put aside the energy absorption piece, I think there are organisms, right, that naturally move to hotter and colder temperatures because that's where they exist best, right?
Right. Yeah. I think it's like, I would say it's like photosynthesis ramped up times a million.
Yeah.
Because, that's how, not pathogens, but plants, that's how they survive. They get their energy from the sun.
Mm-hmm.
Same way we survive. All of our energy, whether, you're a vegan, vegetarian, or an omnivore, you're getting your energy from the sun in some way. So this is kind of just a very scaled up version of life.
But how do you think this organism knows? I get the part about the sun.
Yeah.
These are big entities, easy to target. They have high temperatures, etc. But how would it know or be able to sense on a galaxy-wide scale that there's more carbon dioxide or the most carbon dioxide on Venus in its atmosphere as opposed to everybody else? I guess logically, and we don't want to, you don't want to humanize the organism too much.
Right.
But logically speaking, I could imagine if it was sentient that it would say, okay, there's not going to be any kind of atmosphere at all on Mercury because it's right next to the sun. So we can disregard that. But if you just look at Venus, Jupiter, and Earth, you can see that there's atmosphere.
Right.
Mars-ish,
Yeah. Not much CO2.
And then we're getting further and further out, so it might, But how do you think it figured it out? Do you think it just went to these various planets and just eventually through some kind of intercellular communication said, okay, there's a little bit of carbon dioxide here, but there's more over here, and there's yet more over here, so we're going to go to this one place?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because it's something I've wondered too, and I'm not sure if I just missed it in the book, is how it travels and why it travels and spreads. If it's, a star, if it's that, efficient that it can drain a star, of being able to support life within a 30-year time span, there's still energy in the star after that point. They're still going to be working on the star long after humanity is dead. So I do wonder, what's the incentive to do interstellar travel to find a new
but maybe
source?
there is no incentive. Maybe it's just how does it get here? It doesn't have to come by traveling
it doesn't
with
have
intention.
To,
it could have caught a ride on a meteor. It could have, flown by, with an asteroid somehow.
Right.
We don't really know, but we do know that asteroids do move. Meteors move around. So I think that's one possibility. Another possibility is, there is movement in space that we don't consider movement because it doesn't have the form that we think it should have form. So, for example, there are solar winds, right? That we think that we can capture using basically solar sails. It's one of the ways we talk about interstellar travel, or at least within the galaxy. We've talked about that.
Right.
So there's enough form, at least in the way of physics,
that they could be propelled
to discuss propulsion. So maybe there's stuff like that going on too, that this organism has figured out how to take advantage of. And if there are solar winds, then maybe there are winds that go beyond a solar system generated by who knows what. In which case, again, if it's just that, depending on the nature of the organism, it could just fly in, it just float in on whatever that is.
Yeah, and we know this is a hardy organism. It has to be. And I think they do describe it a little bit in the book that it can survive extreme environments more than kind of anything we've actually seen.
Do they look at it under a microscope?
They do, yeah.
Okay.
Because there's one point where Grace is trying to figure out how to kill it. He puts it through these battery of tests. He has this state-of-the-art lab. He can't figure out how to kill it. And then the way he ends up being able to even penetrate the cell wall is by using it's either like a nano needle. So a needle on the nanoscale. And that's when he gets super excited and he's like, I got it. Like I can stab it with this and break the cell wall and kill it. And then Eva Stratt, who is the former ESA administrator and also now the de facto leader of the world in a way, she's like, so you poked it with a stick.
Basically.
You have all this high-tech equipment and you poked it with a stick. And he's like, well, yeah, but it worked.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an extremely hardy pathogen or life form, and it has to be to survive the energy of the sun.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. But from a interstellar travel perspective, I do wonder,
how is it moving? How is it
moving around? And it could be that it just gets in proximity, because another thing that we know, the reason that Grace is sent to Tau Ceti is because they notice this solar systems around us, that not just ours but others, also have this dimming effect, and the only one that doesn't is Tau Ceti.
Right.
That's why he's sent to Tau Ceti. Just okay, what's going on here? Because the outbreak, I wouldn't even call it an outbreak. It's something beyond pandemic, because it's not just global. It's interstellar. Tau Ceti is the only one that doesn't have this starlight dimming effect.
Well, and look, as for any pathogen, where do these things come from?
Yeah,
we don't know. We have theories on our planet, and I guess all of our planets, about how life might have started. But this is different. This seems like a different kind of life, and we can't. We're not going to know. Although I will say, when I listened to the book, I did think about it the whole time. Like, where did this come from?
Yeah.
How did this arise? And usually there's some reason for stuff. On our planet, there's some reason for it. We may not like it, but there's a reason. There's a particular kind of virus. Or some people, as you know, they develop certain conditions, genetic conditions, that while they cause disease, that same disease protects them from yet a different disease.
Exactly.
Right? Like with sickle cell.
Or Crohn's disease was
Crohn's.
Another one that the same genetic factors that a lot of people have for Crohn's are associated with surviving the Black Plague.
Right.
Back in Europe.
Right. So it just makes you wonder, okay, if we're saying that this is an organism, which we are, and it behaves like an organism in many ways, which it does, then why did it arise? What would be the purpose, the universal purpose of it? Right. It's obviously not to go around and drain suns just for the sake of it, unless, maybe there's an energy imbalance in the universe. Maybe it's got something to do eventually with black holes and that kind of, astrodynamic set of characteristics. We're not going to be able to solve it or to even talk about it much more on this podcast, but I think it's interesting because from a biodefense perspective, if we're going to defend against it and do more than just poke it with nano needles, like, what are we going to do? We're going to deploy 20 bazillion nanoneedles out into...
There wouldn't be enough material.
There's no way to do it, right? And even if you did, what would be the second order, not just impacts, but also requirements. You'd have to launch those. They'd have to be launched along the line. You couldn't just do part of it, because I would imagine the two pieces of the line, would just come right back together again. And you can't start it from the sun and go all the way out. You can't start it from Venus and go all the way back. In theory you could, but it's too. We wouldn't have those kinds of resources for decades.
Right.
How would you do that? So, it's just one of the ways we talk about biodefense, and when we talk about medical countermeasures, or even destruction of a disease or an organism, you characterize it, you figure out what you can do to kill it, and then you do that. But part of all of that is figuring out why it exists in the first place. How is it moving around?
Why is it so invasive?
Why is it invasive?
Yeah.
Does it serve some kind of purpose? You may not agree with that purpose, and maybe the purpose is now outdated. Right. We don't have the Black Plague. People with Crohn's are not living in Europe necessarily near Black Plague sites.
Right.
It's just leftover. Even then, taking it one step further, on the human side, if you were to go and say, okay, we're going to genetically alter you, or your progeny to prevent this from occurring anymore, what does that then secondarily do to your children? What does that do? Does it make them more susceptible than anybody else to the plague? We do still have plague. It's endemic in the United States
and in Madagascar and.
Yeah. So I just think it's interesting. It's not well explained in the book, and maybe it's too difficult to explain, because now you're getting into, I would imagine, sort of spirituality and philosophy of life and everything. But in terms of defense, I think that's a critical set of information that we would be missing from a biodefense perspective to defend against this, or to defend our world against it.
Right.
Now, that's probably, it's reality. They may figure it out, 100 years from when the story starts.
Right.
After a whole lot of research.
After a whole lot of research and time.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting too, because you compare it to something like COVID. Mm-hmm. It's very easy to see how that went around the world. Mm-hmm. Now, if we had interstellar space travel, like in Star Trek, mm-hmm. I could see how this could spread very easily. Especially because eventually later on they use astrophage for fuel.
Yeah.
To get to Tau Ceti, because
mm-hmm.
they're like, oh, it's it can pack a ton of energy in this small, like cell size mm-hmm. Organism.
Which is not, that's not a far reach.
Yeah.
When you think about what we're already talking about with cells, the amount of memory they contain, or just DNA by itself, right? There's so much that can be stored there.
Yeah.
So it doesn't, it's not too far. It's not some crazy jump.
Right.
To have this be a believable scenario.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I think it also speaks to, if we're talking about astrobiodefense and astrobiology, looking for, life as we don't know it. Mm-hmm. If we're always just looking for life as we know it, what we're only going to find, if we find anything.
Right. Or
something that we recognize. But this is something totally different. It's not. But it is interesting at the same time, because I think Grace's whole thesis, when he was a microbiologist before he became a school teacher, and the reason he quit his microbiology career was because he wrote a paper saying that, life forms could exist without water. Mm-hmm. And then he found out that the astrophage does, in fact, mm-hmm. need water, or it has water within its cell.
Right. Well, I agree with that entirely.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would necessarily label the sun as a living thing. We would have to, talk about
then you're
that.
Getting philosophical.
But you could at the very least say there are things that attack other things that we need for life, right? We need the sun. We need
there's
atmosphere.
Algae that eats plastic, or bacteria that will eat plastic. Plastic mm-hmm. isn't alive, but they'll eat plastic.
Right. So... Yeah, it does broaden at least the notion of what ecology is, what
Yeah.
our needed ecology is for life.
Yeah, definitely agree.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to? Well, I think let's describe the relationship with Tau amoeba,
Okay.
and then we can kind of get into the characters a little bit. I think.
Okay.
So Tau amoeba is named it, after Tau Ceti, and it's basically a predator, like the natural predator to astrophage. It's the reason why Tau Ceti's sun is not dimming, is because that solar system has this Tau amoeba organism in it, and it can consume astrophage, and that's basically the solution that that Grace figures out while he's out there is, okay, this is how we do it. We have to counteract this pathogen with another organism, and then but what he has to do in order to do that is he has to do basically gain of function experiments on Tau amoeba, because nitrogen is lethal to Tau amoeba, and Venus's atmosphere has nitrogen. So if you just sent the Tau amoeba that you got from Tau Ceti to Venus, they would all die, and it wouldn't help the astrophage problem. So he does gain of function experiments you could describe them as gain of function, and to basically make them resistant to nitrogen. And then eventually that research leads to the Tau amoeba escaping from the lab and from the contained containers that they're in, because they also evolved to get around those specific containers, because it apparently is really good at evolution. So it eventually escapes and then kills all the astrophage on board the aboard the Hail Mary, which is all the fuel. And it also does that on another character ship, which we'll get into, I think, when we discuss the characters. But I think it is interesting that, they raise this idea, okay, he went 12 light years across, the stars, and the solution was another organism. And then the solution further was you have to manipulate and modify that organism.
Well, he assumes that you have to manipulate and modify the organism.
Right.
The organism exists already with the ability, right, Tau amoeba already can eat, destroy astrophage.
Right.
So that part is there. It's not, I don't think, he was manipulating the organism because we have environmental conditions that we have to take into account. And from a resource standpoint, we cannot go and change the entire atmosphere of Venus in a short amount of time to allow for this.
Right.
But that would have been another way to do it. You wouldn't have had to modify the Tau amoeba. You could just go over and see if you can figure out how to get rid of all of the nitrogen
in Venus's
on
atmosphere.
Venus, then that's it.
And I don't think that's even a crazy proposition or plan, because think about what they had to do to get the Hail Mary off the ground in the first place. It was a huge effort involving all countries, the top scientists in the world, and they had really no time to do it. It was going to be a 26-year journey with the best technology that they could hope to make, for the ship. So one could argue, had they known, but they didn't know. That's the thing. I was going to say one could argue they could have changed Venus's atmosphere probably with the same amount of resources or a similar amount of resources.
Well, I don't know. When you think about pollution,
but they needed Tau amoeba, and they also didn't know that.
Well,
Tau amoeba.
I don't know. We're talking about things. What's interesting about the book, I think, is that we're talking about things we can relate to on a microscopic scale, but now we're talking about it on the planetary and interplanetary, universal scale. It should be easy enough to go to somebody else's planet and then pollute it to the point that you get rid of something. That's one of the big concerns we have now about here change, on Earth. Now, we haven't been doing it necessarily on purpose, and it's been over many decades, obviously. But if you had to, really quickly, but I would then ask, what would happen like I don't know that we know enough about how planets now behave.
Right.
So you could go in and really try and screw with Venus's atmosphere, only to have it rebound, right? Because
Right.
the planet. Now again, we're back to what counts as life, and there are many people who think that our entire planet, in and of itself, is a living
Live.
thing.
Yeah.
So it makes sense then that the living thing would rebound, that it would react
evolve.
and say, okay, well now I need to overcompensate with this other thing, and then you might even have more nitrogen in that atmosphere
Right.
than you started with. But it's. I think the point I want to make about it is that it's not beyond scientific imagination and capabilities right now. We're not talking about, and the book makes it clear, we're not talking about technology that's that much more advanced than what we have this
at this
second
moment. Yeah, because it takes place like basically now, and they're just throwing everything they have at the problem.
Right.
It's one of the reasons why, the coma-induced cryo sleep. I'm not even sure that they used cryo or if it was just coma. It might have been just coma-induced. I don't know if they used cryo.
I think it was just coma. I don't know.
But like,
I don't remember.
It gets to the point, because if it is just coma-induced, it's like, yeah, well, we can't do cryo yet, so we're going to... And the reason that they tried to put everybody into a coma during the ship, the ship's journey, is because I guess there were studies that had shown I think the study they referenced came out of Russia,
right?
That if you put people in an isolated environment for that long, they'll eventually kill each other.
Yeah, I think there are other studies too, though. We have.
I know we have one here in the U.S.
We had a biodome
Yeah.
here in Arizona. I don't know if it's still here, but they put people in there and just closed up the dome. Now it was a large dome.
Yeah,
it wasn't
a lot of room to.
Yeah, it wasn't the size of a spaceship. It was pretty large. Nobody killed anybody in that.
Right.
But it wasn't great either. The notion
right.
of restricting somebody. So I don't know. I think some of this just serves the story and the drama, right?
Which is fair. Creative license and.
Well, I mean, how much do we want to see somebody age in space over 26 years?
Right.
You'd kind of have to pick somebody who's really young, but you could find somebody like that. It wouldn't be that old, in other words,
right.
if they're in space for a couple of decades. How long does he wind up being in space before he wakes up?
I want to say...
Was it 12 light years?
12 light years, and somehow they did the trip in 26 years. So they were moving at a third of the speed of light.
Oh.
I think.
Okay.
Using the astrophoto.
Right.
I could be wrong about that. But
so, if you could find somebody who's 26 years old and has their PhD and is extremely bright, in theory, you could send them out and they'd just be, in
50,
space for 26 years.
And be 52.
But I don't know. There's a lot that isn't taken into account here. And, I know we're getting away from actual biodefense, but what will happen, whether you're in a coma or not, your muscles are going to atrophy out in space.
Right.
We know that. And if you're lying around for 26 days too, that's not going to be helpful to your atrophy.
You're not going to be.
I don't remember them talking about that too much.
So they had this, at the beginning of the story, I think it was a very rudimentary AI robot thing that could do medical care. It would flip you on your side so you didn't get bed sores. It would feed you through an NG tube.
So it probably did what we would do with a person
an actual
in a coma
patient, but it was a robot, and it was. They had
you don't have to do that much. I mean, coma patients, that's why they, people come in and they just move their muscles around. Right. They're just moving limbs around. You could do that with a robot, I would imagine. Or even if you could probably stimulate muscles and, they're going to move on their own.
Activity.
Yeah, that would be even less of an issue for the robot.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it speaks to the need, when you're talking about biodefense, it speaks to the need to have to address a whole lot of other things. It's not just what is the organism, what is the countermeasure for the organism, what are we going to do to combat or kill the organism? It's not just those three things.
Right.
You know, all these things exist in an environment. I mean, even here on our planet, if Russia were to use its biological weapons against Ukraine, as an example, with Russia having already admitted it has a offensive biological weapons program, if we say, okay, we're going to go do something about that, there's still an entire environment there. It's not just about, well, do we have an antibiotic for something or an antiviral for something? It's also how are we, inactivating something or decontaminating, and then what is that doing to the environment
and the animals there,
and the animals and the plants and the people, right? So you could also say we're going to drop a nuclear bomb, just to kill the pathogen, which is okay, but now you've screwed with the entire world's ecosystem, right? And its atmosphere, and nobody's going to put up with that. So. Well, I mean, even if you had to put up with it, it's not a decision you just sort of enter into lightly. Exactly. So the notion of biodefense and the plan for biodefense, even here in our constrained environment, is way more complicated. And, taking action against it, I think, is way more complicated than just, point, counterpoint. It's one of the reasons we recommend so much in the way of strategy and policy review. It's one of the reasons we recommended the DoD do a policy review for itself, because when we made that recommendation back in 2015, they had not reviewed their biodefense posture and policies since like the 70s or the 80s or something.
Yeah.
It was so long ago. Of course, that was based on their notion at the time of biological weapons programs. As they existed back then. And that's, completely reasonable. It's just that after a while, I think people just sort of thought there aren't any more of these anyway, so why do we need to update? Now they realize they have to, with Russia and North Korea having offensive biological weapons programs, with Iran and China said to be close behind, if not already there, just not with proven programs.
Right.
It's one of the reasons we said that. It's one of the reasons we said we need a national biodefense strategy. It's just way more complicated, and there are way more things that you have to think about than just, here's a disease, we will respond to it, and that will be the end of it.
That'll be the end of it. Yeah. Because there's a lot of moving parts, and I sometimes I don't think people realize, like, even just talking about distribution of medical countermeasures, diagnostics, PPE, that was a huge issue during COVID.
Yeah.
And with this, this novel and the story, that's one of the factors. It's distribution. How do we get except the distribution in this case is the information that they need to defeat the virus.
Yeah.
Or defeat the pathogen.
Well,
so
even him,
even
Ryland Grace, when he figures out what needs to be done, he's not even near our planet.
Yeah.
He has to figure out how to send
he has no way home.
Stuff back to Earth without the things that he thought we'd have in the first place.
Right.
He
did have the Beatles.
He did have the Beatles, but he had to repurpose them, right? So that technically they were part of the supply chain and they weren't part of the plan, which gets us to, one of the things that NASA does so well is try and figure out the solution to all these, a variety of problems, saying or starting with, this is all you have.
Yeah.
Whatever it is on this spacecraft is it, or maybe on a planet if you happen to be on a planet. You don't have anything else. You can't conveniently say, well, we're going to send something from Earth, or we're going to send something from the moon, or we're going to do whatever. It's one thing that I think this book does a really good job of illustrating, even though they don't really mention NASA that much.
Right.
But really, I think NASA's perspective is all over it. That way of developing solutions in advance of problems is something I think we need to do much more throughout our government, but particularly for those departments and agencies, or those parts of departments and agencies that have biodefense responsibilities. They have to start thinking in advance, like, what happens when this weird thing occurs, generating those kinds of scenarios, and then saying, like, we're saying right now with avian influenza, like we said with COVID, well, this is all we have. We're not to the point right now, for example, with avian influenza. We don't have a universal influenza vaccine. Even though we've been working on one, we don't have one.
Yeah.
So we can't say in some tabletop exercise, we'll just use the universal vaccine. We don't have one. So, I think it does a good job. I think the book does a good job of illustrating that need to do what we can and think about stuff in advance.
Right. Because I think, they got lucky in the book that all countries started working together. One person was given unilateral leadership to execute the project, and also unlimited resources. It's not always going to be the case. Even with COVID, that wasn't the case. It wasn't unlimited resources. It was not countries working a bunch, like every single country on Earth working together. There were siloed responses, and
I would add too. Right now, even with our approach to global health security, the United States, have a national global health security strategy.
Right.
We have a national intelligence estimate for global health security, and that's great. But we don't have, an international global health security agenda.
Response or apparatus.
We don't have any of it.
Yeah.
And the best we can say is, or best we can hope is that a lot, not even every. A lot of countries have something similar. That's the best. Plus, adding on the United Nations and organizations like the World Health Organization. It's like this loose
they're not
fabric,
going to mobilize the
of,
entire world.
Well, I think
work together to act on a problem.
We don't know that wouldn't happen. I think that with this kind of doomsday end of the world scenario.
Yeah, we have like 30 years to figure this out.
We hope that everybody would pull together like they do in The Martian.
Right.
Like they do in, lots of things. But even in the book, JT, I would say there are places where you can tell countries are pulling together, but they're kind of not. Yeah. They're still kind of competing, or they're still holding on
to certain
information and technology. I think there's at one point, the Russian. I think there's a Russian person. I don't know that they're an astronaut, but it's late. It's not like everybody comes to the table and puts all their cards down and says, "This is everything we have."
Yeah.
But later, when a solution is needed, the Russians do step up and say, "Okay, well, we have this and we know this," but they didn't do it up front.
Right.
And I don't think, by the way, the United States would either, because this scenario is so extreme. I think it's a natural thing to think it's really not as big a problem as it actually winds up being in the book, right?
Right.
So if you think that, then you don't want to give away your economic advantage. You don't want to give away your military advantage.
Right. If you figured out some really unique properties of astrophysics, and the Russian scientist was the one who developed the astrophage-based propulsion system and figured out that it could be a fuel, and discovered its mass, conversion properties. Mm-hmm. If there wasn't an existential threat, why would you give that up?
Right.
If it's,
and when you look at it from the perspective of biology right now and biotechnology right now, we're in the midst of, the biological age. That's what they're saying now. That the previous one was industrial, this one's biological. And we have nation states like China investing tens of billions of dollars, and that's what we see in the open source literature.
Yeah.
So we assume there's even more than that going on. And if China's investing that much, then Russia's definitely having to gear up because that country is right next to it. Putting aside any other kind of motivations.
Stuff like Ukraine or anything.
Yeah, just put it all aside. We would do the same thing if we saw Canada investing 20, 30, 40, 50 billion dollars in biotech and biological advances and, to generate more in the way of the bioeconomy for itself. We wouldn't just be sitting around going, well, that's good for you, Canada. We're going to stay over here and do our little bit. There's no way. We would do the same. I think that it would be very difficult to break out of that mindset, even in this particular scenario.
Yeah.
But it's difficult right now for people to break out of that mindset. If you think about what happened with COVID, we did not have the international cooperation that we maybe could have. And if you believe that the Chinese developed their vaccine first, if you believe that, that means at least that they were working on something without telling us about it. And I don't mean like the actual organism in the lab. I'm talking about the vaccine. Same thing, people, entities, countries, people were coming up with their own stuff.
Yeah.
Were they sharing? Were they not? I think the best thing that happened during COVID in terms of sharing was when they decided to share the sequence.
Which was late.
It wasn't like, oh, look, we found this out. Here it is.
Right. It was late, and I think it was a similar situation with SARS-CoV-1.
Mm-hmm.
That the reporting from China was late on what was going on and the sequence,
And we have to talk about biosurveillance too, right? First of all, I don't know how you conduct biosurveillance on the astrophage, but conveniently
they were lucky there was like a line.
There's a line, right? There's just a line.
Yeah.
But our biosurveillance, it sucks. It's terrible. Ours is not good.
Yeah.
I know that we have self-rated ourselves as number one on the assessment.
Yeah.
The national assessment, but that doesn't mean that we're very good at it. Even now, we're not.
I even think the UK is better than.
Well, I think the UK, Israel, and some other countries are better because they
did really well during COVID in the beginning.
But that's because they have universal health care or something like it. So everybody's sort of part of the system, right? And so they are. And
because they have better I don't know. They were I know South Korea was using the World Health Organization diagnostic, whereas we decided to make our own, and that it didn't end up working. And then the UK had, Oxford Nanopore. They had the sequencing capability that we just did not have. So they were able to track variants. They were able, I don't know if you remember, but back when it first started, we were naming strains after where they came from.
Yeah.
So I think like the second or third strain was called the UK strain, and that was one of the more transmissible ones. It wasn't just because it originated there; it was because they were the first ones to detect it.
Right. Which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Which is unfair, and I'm glad we switched away from that because it wasn't
unfair.
even useful. It wasn't, but it's not useful information either.
Yeah. Why are you going to punish the country who actually
found it and
told
you about it?
Told you about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there are implications here for biosurveillance. If we're saying that this is an organism, this astrophage is an organism, and we talk about Tau amoeba as being another organism, how are we going to conduct biosurveillance on the interstellar scale?
Yeah.
If there's no convenient bright white light, line from the sun directly to another planet, how are we going to do that? We're going to have to figure it out somehow. Now, it is an organism, so you could go with some sort of sampling technique, but now you're talking about sampling the entire universe. Right. I just think that there are implications here. Even here on this planet, we need to figure out a better way to go about biosurveillance and biodetection.
Yeah.
Our detection systems are terrible. Even the better ones are still terrible. We don't have diagnostics in advance. We kind of, screw around and wait, and then somebody finally develops one, and then it gets contaminated, and then we develop another one, and we finally get our acts together on it. All of these things these sorts of recommendations that we've made on a national scale, I think still apply on a planetary scale. It's just that the questions are more open-ended. How do you do it? We know we have to do it. How do we do it?
Well, from like a high-level view, we talk about in the recommendations a lot, threat agnostic surveillance and detection, and I think that's important in the context of the novel too. If that line wasn't there and the sun just started dimming, and there wasn't something you could clearly see that was causing it, and somewhere you could go and like send a probe and get samples,
right?
What do you do then? Like it's a much more extreme example of needing threat agnostic
It is. Well, and
surveillance,
actually, it's
but-
an example of making something easier on ourselves because, plus some sort of deployment strategy, right? Because you'd have to deploy
Right.
the diagnostic somehow. But I think in that case, in the scenario you're raising, we would wind up having to go into this extremely austere, crazy, extreme
Right.
environment. We would have to send some people to the sun, which I know there are movies and things about that too that
Yeah.
talk about doing exactly that, but that would take even more time than
what they actually
taken in
did.
this book because
Yeah.
they just have to create a couple of spacecraft and some little spacecraft to
Yeah.
go with it, and go somewhere, launch somewhere, and then figure out how many years it's going to take and deal with that, as opposed to going into this extremely hot environment.
Yeah, and trying to figure out how you can even get a spacecraft to.
Yeah, and then
survive.
you'd still have to fly around the sun until you finally found the organism, right? It's
Right.
not like it's coming from the sun directly.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's it's interesting how much of what we consider to be biology and how we approach biology is still the same for something on this scale. It's just that we have even less when it comes to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I do think that we do need to talk about the leadership issue because you mentioned it a few times now.
Yeah. So so Ryland Grace is the protagonist. The other main character in the novel is Eva Straat. She's a Dutch woman. Was previously the administrator at the European Space Agency, and then she was subsequently given absolute international authority, agreed upon by everybody, to stop astrophage, which led to the Hail Mary mission. And she also had, complete, legal immunity. She could do whatever she wanted, and then she had unlimited resources from every country. So, when she eventually picks up Grace, he gets sent to like a Chinese aircraft carrier, to a Russian launch pad, to a bunch of different things. He has F-16s, from the U.S. bringing him places. So she has, complete unilateral authority to do whatever she wants. And, in this kind of extreme situation, it does sound authoritarian, but she was effective. And, it depends on the person, but.
Well, I don't know. Is it authoritarian if everybody agrees to it?
It's a good question.
Because I think in this case, well, first of all, I'm not convinced everybody agreed to it.
Well,
but,
no, yeah, I'm sure there were definitely countries who were like, no, I want my person there.
Yeah, and we just, the rest of us just rolled right over them, or they didn't understand what they were,
Right.
agreeing to. But or they agreed and didn't really agree. But I think this is more a case of everybody understanding there's an efficiency issue here. We would not have time to sit around and come to consensus-driven
take 2 weeks for
decisions.
a UN conference.
Yeah,
where
the United
everyone's getting
Nations
to air.
Approach wouldn't work. But let's not even just point the finger at the United Nations. We would not have time for Congress to have numerous hearings and have people appropriating funding, moving funding, approving the movement of funding out of mandatory spending lines over to something else. We wouldn't have time for that. We wouldn't even have time. We might have time for Congress to do an emergency supplemental for NASA. But if it's for more than NASA, more things, more entities that are not necessarily part of the government, which you would need for a situation
for
like
international,
private sector.
Right. It's multiple
we don't even have a
committees.
way to do that, right?
Right.
Congress can't just say we're going to give $100 billion to the cosmonauts over in Russia, or we're going to give $100 billion to this private sector, SpaceX.
Right.
It's just not. There's no mechanism to do that easily, and there shouldn't be, because otherwise it would be completely crazy. It would be a complete free-for-all. But so they couldn't do it, and we have checks and balances in place to prevent the president our
From doing
president
that.
from doing that. And I bet there are checks and balances in place to prevent, the Director General of the United Nations from doing it, lots of entities from
Right.
doing it. So I think it's interesting in the book that while they talk about this need for national leadership, they're pretty clear about
Global leadership.
and
even.
global leadership. It does really still boil down to individual personalities.
Right.
Yes, we're putting people in leadership positions, but they have to be the right people. And I think the issue is that they are empowered. That's really what you're talking about.
Right.
It's not necessarily authoritarian as much as it is we decided to authorize
Right.
and give somebody the authority to do these various things and other things that we couldn't even think about. But the constraint, the pressure on it is because of time. Like everybody recognized, okay, we can't. There's not going to be enough time, and
We have
we're
a
all
few
going to
decades,
die
and
if we
that's it.
don't do this.
Yeah.
So I think the question then for us, when the commission talks about leadership, we're sort of assuming that we can do whatever needs to be done for biodefense in the framework of our current U.S. government and with scenarios that have to do with things that have pretty much already happened.
Yeah.
Even things that are horrible, like the 1918 pandemic and the Dark Ages, the plague during the Dark Ages. We that's our approach. But I think that this shows us that clearly, at least according to the book, that's not enough. Right. That's
Right.
just
It's
not. It's
enough.
not going to
You
be
can't just
enough
roll with it.
to say, oh, the National Security Advisor is in charge of the biodefense enterprise.
Right.
I mean, that I don't even know that that's relevant in terms of
In a
this
catastrophic
book.
scenario like this.
And the
Yeah.
same thing with our first recommendation about being in charge of the biodefense enterprise. In this book, would it make any difference if it was the Vice President of the United States?
It
I don't
wouldn't.
think so.
Yeah.
Right? So how you go about, I just think it's very interesting. How you go about choosing various people, and then in this book, the role of science. You can't have a whole bunch of people in leadership positions who don't know jack about science.
Right.
You could not do it.
She had to be
She had to be a
a
scientist.
scientist.
And the scientists had to be more than just scientists. They couldn't just be scientists. They had to understand the geopolitical situation in which they found themselves. I think that there's a lesson there for us
Yeah.
to be paying attention to. I think we need to, this notion of empowerment, the notion of scenario-based planning where we're stretching our minds in terms of what those scenarios are. And then the notion of what it means to be an expert or a leader in a particular field. We can no longer, I don't think we should be saying, not just on the basis of the book, but on the basis of the experience we've had recently with all of the pandemics that have been going on and are still going on, we can't have people who just have one thing, one credential. They
Right.
were a general, or they have a doctorate, or they were a virus hunter. None of those things by themselves is enough. And so I think there are
Right.
implications then for doctoral programs and development programs, leadership programs. I think we have to expand what we mean by all of those things. But to do with biodefense.
Right. And I think that's an excellent point, and it's something that like I've heard of before. Like doctoral programs, they need to become more inter or multidisciplinary. So you can't just be getting, a PhD in evolutionary biology, but it could be evolutionary biology and public policy.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting both. You're getting the scientific information that you need to make change in the world in scientific ways, but then you're also getting that policy experience to figure out how to actually make it materialize in the real world.
But it's difficult, I would say,
difficult
right?
to do.
Because we're not used to doing that. When you look at like the academies of science, not just here in the United States but elsewhere, the academies have a tendency to say the only people that can be members of our erudite organization are people with PhDs.
Yeah.
The kinds of doctoral programs you're talking about actually do exist, but they're considered to be, practical. So
Yeah.
like the doctorate in public health
The doctorate in public health.
versus the PhD in epidemiology.
Right.
You know, if that's how we've been all of these centuries, right?
Right, centuries,
You know,
yeah.
then undoing that is, I think, going to be difficult. And I would also say, just in terms of recent experiences, not so much with the academies, because I think they do understand what we're talking about, but with academic institutions, whether or not they value a student learning to speak to the media, or a student taking the time to have perhaps like a secondary fellowship or something
Right.
with the government, a student going to a conference that might have to do with policy, a student interacting on an international scale with other students or, you know, other faculty in other universities. That's not something that actually fits with the publish or perish paradigm, right?
Exactly.
You
No,
know,
you're
we have a
absolutely
whole
right.
competitive thing. So I don't know how we get over it, but I think it's made pretty clear in this book that there's no way anybody could live throughout this entire book unless you had those leadership qualities. Now, Strat identifies them in Ryland Grace just because she's observing him and
Right.
she's looking at him and she's seeing and she's taking the time to look at what he wrote and how he reacted to it and what his personality was, and they do
Right.
the tests and all of that stuff. I would hope that we don't have to wait until things become so dire that, well, we kind of don't have any choice and we just have to pick people who innately have these characteristics.
Have these characteristics, yeah.
You
and
want,
send them.
especially when you can develop them.
Right. And even like on a simpler level, you know, like the AI bio convergence, there are so many fields that are converging. It's not enough to just be a biologist, have a PhD in biology. I mean, yeah, sure, you can use AI in your thesis and in your dissertation, but you need there's a need, I think, for, you know, converging fields
Yeah.
to be a focus. So being able to get a PhD in both, you know, AI and bio,
Without it being prohibitive,
Without it
without
being-
having to pay twice.
yeah, without having to pay twice, or, you know, even other fields, agriculture and AI. Why not, right?
Right.
Things like that. So I think, you know, it really speaks to, you know, how all of our technologies are kind of converging on one another and becoming more and more involved in our lives. So they're converging with public policy. I think there's like an educational, you know, shift that might need to be happening.
I agree. And I think that, you know, we're talking about it with biology and chemistry, right? They're becoming exactly the same thing. In the case of the scenario that we have in this book, you have the convergence of something we consider to be interstellar, whatever that is,
Right.
with regular old ordinary biology.
Right.
That's really what's happened. That's probably how this even arose, right? You know, there is a
Yeah.
convergence. I don't know that we have a lot of people who are expert in any kind of convergence, what
Right.
you do about it, and where it goes from there. One of the things that we say about AI bio, cyber bio before and now AI
Yeah.
bio, is both of these fields are evolving separately and together. What are the implications? I think that people who are running around saying, you know, with their hair on fire, saying we got to do something about AI bio, you know, God bless them. I think that's great, but they're running around in a three-dimensional world where AI and bio are evolving at such a rate that they're just outpacing
Surpassing those dimensions.
those
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
Yeah.
So do something. Yes, we need to put some band-aids on where we're at right now and get some things under control. But I think it's just way too late. As with the scenario in this book, it's too late, right? It's too
Right,
late
it's too
for us
late.
to go back in time and somehow figure out how to prevent the spread of this organism to our galaxy.
Right.
It's here, okay. But one thing that Andy Weir does not address in his book is, where are we going from here? That organism, we should be assuming that now you're putting pressure on the organism, just like you put pressure on a virus or a
Like they
bacteria.
put pressure on Tau amoeba.
Right. We put pressure on Tau amoeba. Tau amoeba evolved
Right.
as you would expect,
Yeah.
right? to get around something. That is what organisms do. So now that this has happened, are we really safer at the end of this book?
Right. And I think the book does end on a very wholesome, happy note, because he does get, notice that the Earth, the
Is
sun
okay.
is okay. But beyond that, there's really not much you can know. It's going to take 12. I'm trying to remember how far away the planet he ends up on is in the Eridani system from Earth, but who knows what's going to happen? I mean, it could turn out that Tau amoeba becomes a threat,
Right.
or that astrophage evolves and.
Or in suppressing one or both of those things, expressing one and letting the other one,
Right,
increase.
yeah.
We don't know. We don't really understand, and Andy doesn't talk about it in the book, but there can't just be these two outer space organisms,
that
right?
have
there have
adapted
to be
each other.
way
there has
more.
To be there has to be an ecosystem,
Right.
On the planet, in Tau Ceti, wherever Tau amoeba originates from, there's an ecosystem there. That's a live organism.
Yeah.
So it can't just be there. There's two, or like an Adam and Eve.
Yeah, that's it.
That's it.
That's it. Those are just the two we found.
Two we found. Yeah.
In a very haphazard way. But I think it has implications for our recommendations with regard to biodefense of the planet. NASA and others pretty much only talk about astrobiodefense in the way of forward and backwards contamination, right? Contaminating someplace else because we bring something there, or contaminating Earth because we bring something back.
Right.
In this case, the contamination
isn't even on Earth.
There. It's in the galaxy.
Right. And it's affecting.
There's nothing that says we were talking earlier in this podcast about how did it even get to our galaxy, and you mentioned it. It's possible, at some point in time in the future, that a spacecraft could bring something back. Nobody could have even exited that spacecraft to go onto a planet or to do something. It could just go somewhere and come back, and now it's carrying other things. So I would say we just released our report with our astrobiodefense recommendations in May, and now I think we kind of have to start thinking about updating that, and just on the basis of what's in this book.
Yeah.
What our notion is, what NASA's notion should be. And I would also say too, when we're talking about leadership, NASA is a world leader when it comes to space-related things. They're not the only entity. There are other agencies throughout the world doing their thing, but they are a leader. I think the collective we should be calling upon NASA, to
put their best foot forward.
Put their best foot forward. They need to do some of the things we were talking about today. They should be fostering leadership in more than just the astronaut corps, because this isn't just about astronauts.
Right. And they have experience with that.
And they have experience
because
with it.
Because they can train a microbiologist to be an astronaut. They've trained.
Correct. Yes,
several other disciplines.
And usually, and the same thing occurs in some parts of the military.
Yeah.
All militaries, as well. Special forces folks, for example, they oftentimes, yes, they might be technically, an infantry person, but that same person is also trained to be a dentist.
Right.
They're still trained to do something else.
You had a degree in public health as an intelligence officer.
Yeah.
So you had that unique experience of understanding what could be in those Scud missiles.
Yeah,
when they're coming.
But how accidental was that? That didn't happen because the Army
made it
encouraged me to do that. It's just that I went for my master's between my bachelor's and when I went on active duty.
Yeah.
And even then, I don't know. I don't want to rag on the Army. Maybe they would have taken advantage of it when I was a military intelligence officer or not, just sort of career-wise. But when we were in a wartime situation, so a situation with urgency like this book's scenario, there was a leader, in this case my battalion commander, who stepped back and said, okay, we have a biological threat. who on my entire staff, who of all my officers could I call upon to help with this? And he came up to me and said, you have a master's in public health. I don't really care that you're a military intelligence officer alone. We have lots of those. We need somebody who is this and this other thing and has leadership qualities. So I think, these are all things that we can do. These are all things we can foster. And in this case, this guy, Ryland Grace, is a microbiologist who then becomes a teacher, who then becomes an astronaut, and actually part of...
Against his will, though.
Kind of against his will, but he becomes it, is the point.
Yeah.
Right? And he's capable of doing it.
Right.
Whether he wants to do it or not is, becomes immaterial to Strat. But he could do it. She didn't pick some overweight, incredibly obese or paraplegic guy that couldn't possibly operate in space, right? So I guess all I'm saying is I think we can be more intentional about preparing for what's coming down the pike or could be coming down the pike. And we don't have to say, oh, what a lovely little fictional book Andy Weir has written, especially when you look at what is happening with our Mars missions and how much of the Martian, well, of course, he was already pulling from what was already going on, but is already turning out to be, in addition, what we have to think about in the future. I mean, when The Martian came out, and I think we're going to do The Martian, right, for one of these podcasts.
I think we should. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, like Andy Weir, this book and The Martian, like they're categorized as hard science fiction. He does the research. Mm-hmm. He doesn't just make up a MacGuffin.
Yeah.
To solve a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, but so the point I was going to make is the day that The Martian opened.
Yeah.
The day before the Martian opened, they discovered water on Mars. And Ridley Scott said, geez, if I had known that would have changed the storyline quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, because he might have retrofitted the rover to get to where the water was.
Find water.
Yeah.
But or even assuming, if there is water on Mars, which we say that there is, then, the scenario for generating water there also becomes different, because really what you're saying is that the ecology of Mars is not what we thought it was.
Right.
The atmosphere isn't even what we thought it was. So I think there's a lot of value in these books, and I also think, I know there are a lot of people who think our even thinking about astrobiodefense is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
Why? Here we are. We're struggling with avian influenza, sort of being more than avian influenza now. We have problems right here, right now, that we should be addressing. But I think books like this sort of stretch the mind and help us think about even the exact same problems we have here on Earth, but think about it in this whole sort of different storyline, this different way.
Yeah.
And in stretching your mind to even accept that this is what happens and this is how it happened, there are lessons that can come back to us.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, because I think it teaches you to not fall victim to failure of the imagination. Mm-hmm. Even with something like COVID, which we all now are kind of just used to in our daily lives, I think a big issue with the response to that was a failure of imagination. Mm-hmm. Asymptomatic spread? No way.
Yeah.
People were like, oh, how, like, that was, I think, a huge shock to a lot of people, including scientists and public health experts.
Or even statements, and I'm not ragging on President Trump for this, but President Trump said something that President Wilson said back in 1918. Both of them said the same thing at first. It's okay.
It's going to pass.
China has it.
Oh, China has it.
China's got it under control. why did we think that? Well, Donald Trump is not doesn't have a
He's not an
PhD
epidemiologist
in biology,
virologist.
didn't have an epidemiology degree, and people had been put into various leadership positions in that administration and in the Wilson administration that really didn't have the background that they would have needed to deal with that.
Right.
I mean, it's the Department of Health and Human Services, right?
Right.
It's not, and before that, it was the Department of Health, education, and welfare. That's a lot to be asking of a political appointee, or even an elected official. So, I just think it's really interesting, and I think our commission should continue to push on not just astrobiodefense, but other things too. I think if only because somebody has to think about these things and sort of throw them out there for the world to discuss.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it really, a lot of the movies and TV shows and books and other media that we're looking at, they're science fiction today.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not necessarily going to be the case for tomorrow.
Right.
A freak of conversation that I've had with my dad a couple times that I frequently always remember him telling me about. Is he grew up on Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
And I've watched some of the old. We might actually have to add an episode that I saw to the podcast.
Oh yeah.
From the 60s.
From Star Trek.
The original. Yeah.
Okay.
But in Star Trek, they had the communicators,
mm-hmm.
which are basically cell phones.
Right.
They have doors. They had doors
mm-hmm.
that open.
Pocket doors. Yes.
Yeah, that open and close automatically when you step in front of them.
Uh-huh.
And my dad would tell me when they first put the mats down,
uh-huh. that
you'd step on to open the door, when they would go to the grocery store with their parents, they would just play with that.
Uh-huh.
And then later on, they just open. They don't even need the mat.
Yeah.
So, science fiction, not all of it obviously becomes reality, but, there's especially for technology, a lot of inspiration
mm-hmm.
comes from that. The people who are making cell phones now were probably watching Star Trek when they were growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, I think it can, kind of give you insight into what potential threats there could be that you might not have ever imagined otherwise. So I do think there's a lot of value in science fiction, and it's very different than other forms of fiction in that way.
Yeah, and there have been attempts by the government, there have been activities by the government, our government at least, to bring science fiction novelists, television writers and that kind of, person into meetings just to generate these scenarios, just to move forward on things. We're asking a lot, I think, of the intelligence community, of the defense community, of any community really, to just sit down by themselves, given whatever it is that they do for real in their careers. We're asking a lot of them to sit there and go, okay, let me just see if I can come up with random scenarios. Yeah. I think it's something they have to do, but I don't necessarily think it's something that their brains are designed to do. Unlike a science fiction novelist or a television, a movie person, they think of things differently. They go in different directions, and they're not constrained by, supposed rules of how the planet works, or how microorganisms work, or how the galaxy works. I can imagine that perhaps when the idea first popped into Andy's head about these organisms out in space and what they might do and what they eat and all of that, I can imagine a microbiologist here, on the planet, our planet, not in the scenario, just right now, saying, well, that's not even possible, right? Because there's no air out there. What about the pressure? What about this? What about that? They would just disregard it.
Right.
Because it doesn't fit in their worldview, which they're experts at.
Exactly. And I give credit to Andy Weir, because he's probably asking questions. Well, why wouldn't it work?
Mm-hmm.
What would it take?
Yeah.
Because I think, I don't remember the specifics, but I think he does address a lot of how does it survive the heat? How does it survive the pressure? How does it survive the zero-G environment? How does it survive, in a low oxygen environment? So I think, I give them a lot of credit for asking these questions, and I'm sure some of the scientists are probably like, what the hell is this guy asking?
Yeah. Well, there's a credibility issue there too.
Yeah.
But there's one other thing I want us to talk about before we end the podcast, and that is, for something like this, I don't think, now that we've heard that they're going to create a movie from this book,
Yep.
It's one thing to write it. It's another thing to have somebody read it. But now you have to have people act it. And we have both seen some truly terrible acting on the part of people who are just not credible as scientists.
Right.
Sometimes it's okay because,
There's a suspension of disbelief.
Or it's like Ryan Reynolds' character in Life. He is an astronaut. He even says it in the movie.
Right.
I can't do what you're doing in there, scientist guy. I can't do that.
Which is what a scientist would say.
A scientist would say that, but what he was saying was, that's not me. I'm the guy that goes out and catches the big, craft coming back. I do different things. So you can get away with it. You can get away with it. But in this case, I think the casting is really important for this movie.
Absolutely.
And, I do think that Ryan Gosling is a good choice because I think that he has
the chops.
He has the chops, and I think he would take the time, to make sure he didn't sound dumb, that he didn't sound like he couldn't, that he can't pronounce things properly as a microbiologist. The character is a microbiologist who published and then became a teacher. So, at the very least, he's still got to be able to, communicate all of that to his own students.
Right.
So I think he's a good choice. I think the person they have come up with for Strahd, is. But there's that whole rest of that cast, JT.
Right.
We can't
those are the two most important, and the third one, which we haven't talked about, but maybe we won't, just because it is a pretty major twist, I think, that happens. And I don't think we need to talk about the third character.
You don't want to talk about the third character?
We could, if you want to, if you think we have the time.
Well, I don't know what else there is to say, but
really except
that character, I think we can say, you already said, you gave him the warning about the spoilers, but you're talking about Rocky, right?
Yeah, talking about Rocky.
So let's just a little bit about Rocky, in that he's not humanoid. He doesn't look like a human being.
Looks like a stone spider.
He looks like
almost.
A stone spider. Whoever it is that winds up having to act in that role. Voice the role or just act in the role.
Yeah, with the animatronic. I'm trying to remember what it's called when they put the little black dots.
The dots and everything on them. I don't know. Whoever that is, that's another
Apes.
skill set.
Yeah.
But I think the challenge in this is that even that Rocky is not some idiot.
Right.
He's not as dumb as a rock.
Yeah, no, he's actually really smart.
He's a smart guy, and he's an engineer on top of everything. Now, he's not a scientist the way Ryland is a scientist, but he is still an engineer, and he's up there all by himself in his own spacecraft, keeping everything going and figuring everything out. So whoever portrays that cannot be a person who doesn't understand anything about engineering and doesn't understand anything about a spacecraft or what it would take to do something. I think almost every single character that we come across in this book, almost every single one of them has some specialized area of expertise, and that Hollywood cannot afford to hire a whole bunch of people just because they're pretty faces or just because they're famous or something if they can't do it. So I just think it would be really interesting. I know we'll never be able to do it, or I doubt that we'll be able to do it, but it would have been so interesting to talk to like casting directors, the actual director, the author, because I would imagine they pulled Andy in on some stuff.
Yeah.
Just to see how they go about this, because we've seen too many science movies where you're just like, oh man, like
they mispronounce.
something, and it just takes you out of the movie
Right.
entirely, or they do something that you as a scientist know you would never do as a scientist.
Right, like running into a contained, like in life, which we'll talk about at some point, running into a contained laboratory
without PPE.
Without PPE, and just start spraying flamethrower around.
Flamethrowers around, or even manipulating an organism without really taking appropriate precautions, other than the ultimate fail-safe. So that we'll make that a teaser for the other one. But I really do think it's important. Andy himself, we're looking at your hardback book here, which is like 2 inches, inches big.
It's big.
It took a lot of time to really do the character development, and I think it was necessary, because I think as a reader, even though you and I are scientists, I think even we needed to know, what's the background? How do you believe that these characters are doing what they're doing? How do we believe the entire story? I think it's not just about the character development in the book; it's going to be about the character development in the movie.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and they need to make sure that they. I think Ryan Gosling and Sandra Huller will do, great jobs in both of those, in those two roles. But there are a ton of other scientists that do play huge parts. It's not just Ryland Grace figuring it all out on his lonesome. There's a whole group of people that got him up into space in the first place.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of people that were originally supposed to go on the mission before they died. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it's extremely important that they get that correct. And, kind of while we're on the subject, I know that we both listened to the audiobook.
Mm-hmm.
Ray Porter, who
voiced
it, just did I don't think I've ever heard such a well done audiobook. The way he changes his voice for Ryland versus Strat, and then for Rocky, even it just sucks you in. And makes you really believe these are people that they know what they're talking about, and especially for Rocky, it's almost kind of like a cute, wholesome but still believable, character and vibe that Rocky gives off, and it still seems alien. It doesn't seem like it's just a person talking, in a weird way. So I want to give him a ton of credit, and I hope they bring him in to voice Rocky. I don't know why.
Well, I don't know. How does that ever work? I think
they're gonna
usually
have to use a puppet or an animation or something.
But don't they usually
Rocky
use an actor to do that? Like in
Planet of the Apes here?
No, I'm thinking more along the lines of like Gollum in The Lord of the Rings. Did they have him
do the animated?
He had the suit on, but they had to use CGI to really slim him down.
Yeah.
But that's his voice.
I don't know. I mean, it depends on.
Or even look at like The Mandalorian.
Yeah.
You never see Pedro Pascal's face until those last few episodes where he insisted everybody had to see his face. Technically, it could have been anybody wearing the suit, and they could act, do the gestures and stuff with Pedro somewhere else voicing it if you really wanted it to be that way. But would it be as authentic? Be as good.
No, because people's facial expressions while they're moving their head, that's just a part of body language.
Yeah.
It's a part of the language, so
but in this case, but JT, in this case, you're talking about this human. Stony spider thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, does that still hold? I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting. One other thing about Rocky, I think, is worth bringing up too, is that the way he speaks is not in words. He doesn't conveniently learn English. It's more that Ryland figures out his language, which is tones.
Tonal, yeah.
And it reminded me a lot of, not a lot. It reminded me of Close Encounters of the third kind, of the fifth kind. I can't remember what it's called. Yeah, third kind. Yeah. Where at the end you have you have the little ship and the big ship, or us and them, sort of suddenly computers are talking to each other and there's music going on all over the place.
Yeah.
It reminded me of that, but obviously not entirely. It was something that Ryland could figure out. Again, I think it's an interesting twist and an interesting thing to add. You noted in the book that they have musical notes written out for when Rocky is saying something without translation. And I noted that there are no bars of music. So you really, even us as a reader, even though you can recognize that there are notes, you don't know what those notes are.
Right.
So you have to kind of fill that in. And you can when you're reading something. When they did the audiobook, they did use tones. So one imagines that they'll do the same thing for the movie, but now you're adding something else, right? Because it's an entity, it's a character. Those tones can't just be somewhere. Yeah.
We have to move with the body.
Yeah.
Language.
So somebody's going to have to invent a language for this character that includes body language and how you might communicate, him looking perhaps, at Ryland, etc.
Yeah. So I think it'll be really interesting. And I know there is, at least I know there's one person, I'm blanking on the name, but he creates languages for movies and TV shows. So for Game of Thrones, he made the Dothraki language, the Valyrian language. I think for the 100, the series, he made the Grounder languge. So that's his whole job is just to make new languages.
There is a part of the military, well, not a part. There is a Defense Language Institute, or at least there used to be. Now, they used to test military intelligence officers for their ability to learn new languages, but they do it with a made-up language.
Interesting.
It's a very interesting test, and most people just they give up halfway through, and they're just laughing about it. And then there are others that they kind of plow their way all the way through. So I wonder if there's something to be applied there too. It's not like an English-based language. It's just some weird off, crazy thing that somehow the military, the army put together. Is would that be applicable? I'm sure it would be applicable. But how interesting, right? So it means that this movie is different, even from some of the other science space kind of movies we've seen. They're adding some additional pieces. They're adding the biological piece or the organism piece. They're adding an alien piece with language.
Yeah, with language.
That's different.
Policy is
different. Yeah. The situation, although sort of end of the world stuff, I know we have certainly seen many movies like that.
Yeah, definitely. But I think they give special attention in this book to the policy and the international collaboration that takes place. And for Project Hail Mary, just to connect it with another one of our projects, it is a grand project. Like the Apollo program for biodefense, except on a much, much larger scale.
Yeah.
But it has all of those elements that we talked about: international collaboration, leadership,
military involvement.
Not even just U.S. military, but the world's militaries got together. So it has all of those qualities from the Apollo program for biodefense.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things we talk about, and we can end on this, is our recommendations and how they fit, or apply. I know we have our Astro Biodefense planetary protection recommendations. We've got 2 of them so far, and clearly they apply. We've already talked about modifying them. I think regular old ordinary public health recommendations still apply. How you do biosurveillance, how you do, things to do to improve biodetection. It's just that we have to be looking, further out now, out into outer space. So certainly we need something better than BioWatch to get us all the way out there.
To get us all the way out there.
I think it'd be interesting. I don't think we should sit here and necessarily list them all, but I think you could look at our blueprint. And even some of the national biodefense strategies probably, and say that they actually would apply. They would just need to be applied,
Right.
You know, it's not enough to say we have this thing and it's just going to be, you know, they're easy to use for outer space and easy to use for in the oceans, easy, you know,
Right.
it's not going to go that way. But I think these kinds of documents make a good start.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Okay, so let's get to the ratings for Project Hail Mary.
Okay.
I think this is probably going to be one of our higher rated reviews here.
Mm-hmm.
I think relevance to commission recommendations, I would give it a 4.5.
I gave it a 4.5.
Yeah. Okay.
I think there were plenty of things. We don't need to run through all the recommendations. I think we already did that. But I think there was nothing in this. Of course, let's just back up and just quickly say, part of the reason for the high marks we're going to give this is because it was an audiobook. There were plenty of hours of audio to listen to. And Andy Weir himself puts so much detail and does so much research for all of his books that, or at least the ones I've read, that it only makes sense to me that he would have done enough research to have unearthed, the same concerns that we would have as a commission. And so therefore it makes sense to me that there would be alignment. So that's why I gave it a 4.5.
Yeah, I completely agree. And then, so for the next category, scientific accuracy, I would also give it a 4.5.
Yeah, I think if we were...
He's stretching a little bit, but it's within...
I think there was one thing that we had an issue with in the entire book. And, it's still a work of fiction. We can't...
Exactly, yeah.
I have read books where they're so loaded down with science and wanting every single thing to be accurate that you're just dying trying to get from page to page to page and keep things moving. So I understand the occasional need to, cut a little corner here and there.
Yeah, of course.
And, for this, I think if we were rating on a scale from 1 to 10, we would give a 9, which, is it seems much closer to the top than 4.5.
Right.
But I say 4.5 too. I'm good with that.
Scenario development, 4.5 or a 5.
I think we should give it a 5.
Yeah.
I rated it as a 4.5, but I don't know what I would have done differently to
change it.
To change it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Entertainment value.
So I think that, again, it is an audiobook, so we have to be fair. Or it's a book, period. And it's a long book. It's not like it's a short book. So there are going to be places where he's just developing the story or developing the characters or doing something, and it's just going to drag a little bit. So 4.5? Are we going to give it a 5?
I would give it a 4.5 or a 5. But like you said, there are parts that might drag on a little bit, but they're very few between.
I think 4.5.
Yeah,
since we're not totally convinced.
Yeah, so if we're not sure it's 5, then yeah okay. 4.5.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then we have success of the imagination or creativity. I think that's a 5.
Okay. 5.
Shock or surprise value?
4.
Yeah, just a 4. I mean, there are definitely some shocking or surprising parts, but it's not deserving of a 5, I don't think.
No, and once you get beyond a certain point, there are no more shocks and surprises.
Right.
It's just, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
That's all. And that's not bad, but,
Government policy. What would you give it for this?
I gave it a 3.5.
3.5?
I gave it a 3.5.
I think that's fair. There are some questionable decisions that were made.
Which he's highlighting.
Yes,
there's a lot. And he's using Grace to articulate those.
Right. Exactly.
And I mean, the whole thing, look, even just we're going to knock this guy out and stick him up on the spaceship, whether he wants to go.
And hope that he comes to, be a hero.
Yeah. That's not good government policy.
Yeah, no.
I'm sorry. No.
Yeah. Direction.
No. Portrayal by actors.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Portrayal by actors. I think that's a 5. There's only one actor. It's still an audiobook narrator.
Well, how do you feel? But how do you feel about Rocky?
I think he did a great job with Rocky. You don't think so?
Well, he didn't do the job with Rocky. Don't they use sounds for Rocky?
Initially, but then...
Yeah, but I think that was
kind of... the translation thing, and then he starts...
He's good.
Yeah.
The guy is good. The narrator is good. The reader is good. But I I'm not giving them I say 4.5.
Okay, 4.5.
Because I'm taking points off for how they were trying to show or portray Rocky speaking. I don't think they were creative enough with that.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you look at the book, it seems more creative.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then we have direction.
I don't know how you. I don't know if that. Yeah, I don't know if it applies in this situation because, well, no. Look, for audiobooks, there is a director. There is. But in this case, it's an audiobook that is not. You know, they didn't add sound effects except for Rocky initially.
Mm.
So there wasn't that much to direct. But either we have to drop this for an audiobook, or we have to take into account that there's not that much to direct, but they did a pretty good job. I don't know. I gave it a 4.5, but...
Yeah, let's give it a 4.5.
Okay.
And then the last category is production.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think this is a similar issue with direction.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, what do we
But I
mean
think
by production again? What are we meaning?
like production value. How well was it produced? Is it like a high?
Overall. Well, look, I mean,
I think it was good.
we read or listened to the entire thing.
We did.
No skipping ahead, no, jumping ahead 30 seconds at a time or anything. No skipping to other chapters.
So.
And you read it or listened to it first,
I listened to it in like
I
a
listened
week.
to it, and you were able to track
Yeah, where you were.
where I was in the story, which tells me that it was produced.
Very.
It was written properly and it was produced well enough that you could do that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay.
I
So,
gave it a 4.
a 4.
I don't know what would take me above a 4.
I think a 4 makes sense.
Okay.
So let's give it a 4.
All right.
4.4 is the final score.
Okay. 4.4. Okay.
All right.
Good.
Well,
Well,
thank you all for joining us on this episode of Biollywood. And as
I
they
thought we were
say,
going to end. What are we saying? As they say, Hail Mary.
full of grace.
It makes me laugh every time. Sorry, listeners. It makes me laugh. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.